The handcuffs bit into Dr. Nadia Reeves's wrist before she even had time to set down her grocery basket. One moment she was standing in the bread aisle of a Harlow Falls convenience store, holding a bottle of orange juice and a pack of crackers she hadn't yet paid for, and the next, Officer Dale Brunner had her arm twisted behind her back with a grip that left bruises for 2 weeks. The store cameras were running, the other customers were watching, a teenage boy recorded everything on his phone, and Brunner, red-faced and certain of himself in the way only men who have never been held accountable can be, leaned in close and said, "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, sweetheart." He had no idea, not even a flicker of suspicion, that the woman he was humiliating in front of 30 witnesses had been building a federal case against him for 7 months. If this story already has you gripped, I want you to stay with me all the way to the end, because what happens next will leave you speechless. If you're new here, please subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. Nadia Reeves had driven into Harlow Falls that morning the same way she had driven into the town every Thursday for the past 7 months. In a 10-year-old Subaru with a cracked side mirror, wearing jeans and a plain green jacket, carrying nothing that announced who she was. That was the point. A woman who looked like she belonged there attracted no attention. A woman who looked like a federal investigator from the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division attracted a very different kind. Harlow Falls was a mid-sized Georgia town that sat 40 miles southeast of Macon, flanked by pine forests and a river that flooded badly every spring. It had a downtown strip with 3 barbershops, a hardware store, a diner called Paulette's, and a police department that occupied a squat brick building on Ridgeline Avenue with bars on the lower windows and an American flag out front that hadn't been replaced since it started going gray at the edges. The population was just under 22,000. The unemployment rate was higher than the state average. And for the past 9 years, the Harlow Falls Police Department had operated with the kind of unchecked authority that small towns sometimes allow when no one is watching carefully enough. Nadia had been watching carefully enough. She had first been assigned to the Harlow Falls file 8 months earlier, when a civil rights attorney named Dorothea Finch contacted the DOJ field office in Atlanta with a complaint that was, on its surface, unremarkable. A man named Elroy Sattler, 51, had been arrested outside his own home for, according to the police report, disorderly conduct and resisting arrest. He had spent 4 days in jail before his case was dismissed. The problem was that the arrest report had been written after the fact. The incident report was backdated, and the officer who filed it, a man named Dale Brunner, had a history of complaints stretching back 5 years, every single one of which had been closed internally without investigation. Dorothea Finch had sent the DOJ a 2-inch binder. Nadia's supervisor, Warren Osei, had called her into his office on a Wednesday morning and slid the binder across the desk. "Preliminary review," he said. "See if there's a pattern." There was a pattern. There was a very clear, very deliberate, very documented pattern that Nadia had spent 7 months assembling into something airtight. Brunner was not operating alone. Chief Gerald Voss ran the Harlow Falls Department the way some people run a protection racket. Favors for certain residents, pressure for others, and an internal system that made complaints disappear before they could accumulate into something dangerous. Officers who pushed back got reassigned or quietly forced out. Officers who played along got promoted and protected. The file on Nadia's secure laptop now contained 47 individual incidents. 6 of them involved arrests that could not be supported by any credible evidence. 3 involved use of force that exceeded any defensible standard. 2 involved evidence that appeared to have been altered after the fact. And 1, the Elroy Sattler arrest, had a witness who had never been interviewed, a retired postal worker named Gloria Chance, who had watched the entire thing from her front porch and been willing to talk to Nadia for 2.5 hours over coffee the previous November. Nadia had not yet made contact with the department. She had not yet filed anything. She was in the final stage of building the case, verifying a secondary financial connection between Chief Voss and a bail bondsman named Terrence Pickett, who appeared to profit unusually well from HFPD arrests. And she needed 2 more weeks, maybe 3. She was close enough that she could feel the shape of what was coming, the way you can feel weather changing before the sky actually shifts. She had not planned to stop at Donahue's Market that Thursday morning. She had been driving back toward the interstate after a meeting with a records contact at the county courthouse, and she was hungry, and the parking lot was close, and it was a decision made in 30 seconds that she would spend a very long time thinking about afterward. She took a basket, she walked the aisles. She picked up orange juice, a pack of peanut butter crackers, a banana, and a small bottle of ibuprofen for the headache she'd had since 6 that morning. She was heading toward the register. She was 8 feet from the register, when a hand landed on her shoulder and spun her around with enough force that the basket swung and the ibuprofen hit the floor and slid under a shelf. "Hold up," said Dale Brunner. He was off duty, but he was in uniform. He had a habit of wearing his uniform even on his days off, which Nadia had noted in her file because it spoke to something about how he understood his own authority, as something permanent, not something issued with a shift. He was a stocky man, mid-40s, with a jaw that was set like he'd been grinding his teeth since childhood. His partner, a younger officer named Seth Cord, stood a few steps behind him, arms crossed, already scanning the store to see who was watching. "I watched you take something," Brunner said. He didn't lower his voice. He wanted people to hear. Nadia looked at the basket in her hand. "I have everything here. I'm going to the register." "I saw you put something in your jacket." "I didn't." "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to empty your pockets." Several things happened in Nadia's mind at once, and she sorted through them quickly, the way she'd been trained to sort through things quickly. The first was the recognition that this was Dale Brunner, the subject of her investigation, a man she had spent 7 months studying, a man whose face she knew from incident photographs and courthouse records, but who had never seen hers. The second was the recognition that he was doing right now, in real time and in front of witnesses, something that she had documented him doing to other people on 6 separate occasions. The third was the recognition that she had a digital recorder running in the inside pocket of her jacket, because she ran a digital recorder whenever she was in Harlow Falls, a habit she had developed in month 2, and it was capturing everything. She made a decision. She would not identify herself yet. "I'm happy to show you what's in my basket," she said, keeping her voice level. "But I didn't put anything in my jacket, and I'd like to know what specific item you're saying you saw me take." "Step over here," Brunner said, gesturing toward the front of the store. "I'd rather just pay for my items and go." That wasn't a request. The store had gone quiet. A woman with a toddler in her cart had stopped moving. The teenager with the phone was already recording, holding it low near his hip the way kids do when they don't want the subject to notice. Nadia noticed. She noted his position mentally and kept her face neutral. She set her basket down on a nearby shelf and turned to face Brunner fully. "Okay, I'm cooperating. What would you like me to do?" What he wanted her to do, it turned out, was to submit to a pat-down search in the middle of a grocery store aisle, which she declined politely and repeatedly, which caused Brunner's expression to shift from the professional blankness he'd been performing for the audience into something harder and more personal. He called for backup on his radio. 2 more HFPD officers arrived within 4 minutes, which told Nadia that there was a cruiser staged nearby. Not an accident, possibly a routine thing on this stretch of road, but filed away. Officer Cord found the ibuprofen on the floor under the shelf and held it up like evidence. "Is this yours?" he asked. "It was in my basket," Nadia said. "It fell when Officer Brunner grabbed my shoulder." "I didn't grab you, I tapped your shoulder." "You spun me around." Cord set the ibuprofen on the shelf without responding. The backup officers were a man named Prentice and a woman Nadia didn't recognize, young, maybe 26, who kept her eyes moving around the store in a way that looked more uncomfortable than alert. When Brunner told Prentice to call it in as a shoplifting stop, the young woman's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Nadia noticed that too. "I want to be very clear," Nadia said, speaking at a volume that carried, "that I have not taken anything. I have a basket of items I was about to purchase, and I'm being detained without cause." "You're not being detained," Brunner said. "Then I'm free to go?" "No." There was a pause in which several customers shifted their weight, and a man near the freezer section quietly set down what he was holding and moved toward the exit, which Brunner tracked with his eyes and then let go. "I need you to come with me," Brunner said. "On what grounds?" "Suspicion of shoplifting." "What item?" "Ma'am." "What specific item are you saying I shoplifted? I'd like you to tell me the item." Brunner's expression changed again, a flicker of something. Not doubt, exactly, but recalibration. He'd done this enough times that he had a routine. The routine worked when people got scared or angry or loud. A woman who stood very still and asked very specific questions in a very calm voice was not what the routine was built for. He looked at Cord. Cord looked at the ibuprofen on the shelf. "We can sort this out at the station," Brunner said. "Am I under arrest?" The word hung there. A few seconds passed. "Yeah," Brunner said. "Yeah, you are." The handcuffs went on in front of everyone. The teenager recorded the whole thing. A woman near the produce section said, loudly enough for several people to hear, "She wasn't doing anything." Brunner ignored her. Cord picked up Nadia's basket and handed it to a store employee like it was evidence he was logging, which it wasn't, which was a mistake he would later have cause to regret. Nadia let them walk her out. She kept her breathing even. The recorder in her jacket pocket was still running. She had made sure of that during the pat-down, which Brunner had conducted in the parking lot before putting her in the cruiser, a pat-down for which he had not called a female officer, which was its own line item. She had noted the time, the location, the number of witnesses, the plate numbers of the 2 backup vehicles, and the exact words Brunner had used at each stage. Her hands were cuffed in front of her, not behind, which was a small practical mercy, but also, she suspected, habitual. Brunner probably found front cuffing easier for managing compliance without leaving marks. The cruiser smelled like coffee and synthetic pine. Cord drove. Brunner rode in front. Neither of them spoke to her during the 7-minute drive to the Harlow Falls Police Department on Ridgeline Avenue, which she had visited twice before under other pretexts and whose layout she knew well enough that she could have walked to the booking area from the parking lot without asking for directions. She didn't do that. She let Cord lead her. The front desk was staffed by a civilian named Roy, heavy-set and slow-moving, who looked up from his monitor when they came in and then looked back down with the specific lack of curiosity of a man who had processed too many of these to register them anymore. 3 other officers were visible in the open area behind the desk. A 4th was coming out of a side hallway with a paper cup of coffee. He saw Nadia and slowed without quite stopping. Brunner handed her off to a female officer for processing, mandatory, at the station, for reasons of policy. And Nadia used the 40 seconds of relative privacy to make sure the recorder was still running. It was. She also noted that the camera mounted above the booking desk had a piece of electrical tape over the lens, which she had suspected from a county maintenance log she'd reviewed 3 weeks earlier but had not been able to confirm until now. The booking officer's name was Adrienne Halsey. She was professional and quiet and moved with the particular efficiency of someone performing a procedure they've performed hundreds of times while thinking about something else. She asked Nadia for her name. "Nadia Reeves." "Address?" Nadia gave her Atlanta address. Halsey typed it without expression. "Reason for being in Harlow Falls?" "Visiting." Halsey looked up for just a moment, then back at the screen. When Brunner came back, he had Chief Gerald Voss with him. Voss was taller than Nadia had expected. She'd seen his official photograph and his body camera footage, but photographs compressed him somehow. And he moved with the deliberate ease of a man who had held authority for long enough that it had become physical, something in the set of his shoulders and the pace of his walk. He was 61. He had been chief for 11 years. He had a son in the department and a brother-in-law on the county commission, and both of those things were also in Nadia's file. "Ms. Reeves," Voss said, as though they'd met before. "Chief Voss." He noted that she knew his name. He didn't say anything about it. "Dale tells me you made some noise in the store." I asked Officer Brunner to specify what item I allegedly shoplifted. He wasn't able to. "Dale's been doing this job a long time." "I'm sure he has." Voss sat on the edge of the booking desk, which was the kind of casual territorial gesture that Nadia had seen described in 3 different witness accounts, a way of making the space his. He folded his hands in his lap. "You have a record, Ms. Reeves?" "No." "Where do you work?" She paused for exactly 1 beat. "I'm between positions right now." "What kind of work?" "Legal." Something shifted in Voss's expression. Not alarm. He was too practiced for alarm, but a small rearrangement of attention, the way a card player looks when the table changes slightly and they're deciding whether it matters. He studied her for a moment and then seemed to decide it didn't. "We'll get this sorted out," he said, and left. Brunner was filing the arrest report at a desk near the window. Cord was talking to Prentice near the coffee machine. The young female officer from the store, whose name tag Nadia had read as Malden, was sitting at a separate desk filling out something on paper, not a computer, which was unusual. She had the look of someone who was concentrating very hard on appearing to concentrate on what she was doing. Nadia was placed in a holding room, not a cell, technically, a room with a table and 2 chairs and a mirrored panel that was a transparent attempt at an observation window. And the door was closed, but not locked. She tested it. Not locked. She sat back down. She had a phone call coming. It was her right. She had not asked for it yet because she was still cataloging. The tape over the camera lens in the booking area. The report being handwritten at Malden's desk instead of entered into the system. The absence of any store employee from Donahue's Market among the processing paperwork she'd glimpsed on Bruner's desk. No statement, no loss prevention report, nothing that would typically accompany a shoplifting arrest. The fact that Cord had taken her basket and then not logged it. The fact that nobody had asked her what she'd actually intended to buy. She sat in the holding room for 22 minutes. She counted them. The recorder was still running. When Bruner came back, he had a printed form which he set on the table in front of her. It was a statement form. He set a pen beside it. "We need you to write down what happened," he said. "I'd like my phone call first." He looked at her steadily. "We'll get to that." "I'd like it now. It's my right." "We're still processing." "You're done processing. I've been printed. My information's been entered. I have the right to make a phone call." Bruner picked up the form and the pen and left the room without saying anything else. 8 minutes later, Cord brought her a phone. She dialed Warren Osei's direct line. He picked up on the second ring, which was unusual. Warren was a third-ring person by nature, something about letting the call establish itself. And she understood from that alone that he had been waiting. "It's me," she said. "Are you at the station?" "Yes. Holding room. No camera. Unlocked door." "Are you okay?" "I'm fine. Everything's running." "Okay?" She could hear him shifting, the sound of him standing up from his desk. "Give me 45 minutes." "I know." "Nadia." He paused. "Do not tell them yet." "I know, Warren." 45 minutes. She handed the phone back to Cord, who was lingering near the door with the specific hovering discomfort of someone who had been told to monitor without being told why. She thanked him. He didn't respond. He left. She sat in the quiet of the holding room and thought about Elroy Sattler, who had spent 4 days in a cell not unlike this one for standing on the sidewalk outside his own house at 10 in the evening. She thought about the 6 other incidents. She thought about Gloria Chance on her porch, holding her coffee cup in both hands and saying, "He just started yelling at him. For nothing." He just started yelling and nobody stopped him. 22 minutes, then 45. She would wait. The door opened at the 38-minute mark, which she hadn't expected, and Voss came in alone, which she also hadn't expected. He sat across from her this time, not on the edge of anything, in the chair, at the table, the way people sit when they've decided the conversation is real. "I'm going to be straight with you," he said. "I'd appreciate that. We get people coming through here sometimes who think they can make things difficult. I haven't made anything difficult. You've been asking specific questions. You know my name. You're not scared." He tilted his head slightly. "Most people are scared." "I don't have a reason to be." Voss studied her for a moment. "What are you doing in Harlow Falls, Ms. Reeves?" "I told Officer Bruner I was buying groceries." "Before the store." She looked at him directly. "I had a meeting." "With who?" "That's private." He nodded slowly, as if she'd confirmed something he already thought. "I'm going to level with you. We've had some people come through lately who've been making inquiries, courthouse, records office, talking to residents. You understand why that would make a department like ours take notice?" "I understand why it might," she said, "if there were things a department didn't want noticed." The silence that followed was long enough to have a shape. Voss pressed his palms flat on the table and stood up. He looked at her for another moment, assessing something, and she held completely still under it the way she'd learned to hold still years ago in depositions, when the other side was looking for anything to push against. "I'll have someone get you sorted," he said. "Chief Voss." He paused at the door. "I haven't been charged yet." "You will be." "On what evidence?" He left without answering. The door wasn't locked. She could hear him in the hallway, speaking to someone in a low voice, not quite low enough, and she caught the end of it. Just process her through. I want her out of here by 5. And she filed that away too. She checked the recorder one more time, still running, 41 minutes and counting since she'd spoken to Warren. Through the thin wall, she could hear Bruner on the phone, his voice carrying the slightly elevated register of a man talking to someone above him in a way he wanted to sound relaxed. She couldn't make out words. She could make out tone. And the tone had shifted since she'd been brought in. Less certain, more managed, the way a voice sounds when someone has been told to be careful without being told why. At the 45-minute mark exactly, the sound of the front entrance reached her through the corridor. The specific sound of multiple people arriving, not the shuffle of walk-ins, but the organized entry of people who knew where they were going and were moving there with purpose. Then voices, more than 2, and the recognizable shift in ambient noise that happens when a space that has been running at a single speed is suddenly running at a different one. Then Warren Osei's voice, very clear, cutting through everything else. I need to speak with Chief Voss immediately. I'm Special Counsel Warren Osei, Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. We have a federal matter that requires his immediate attention. The holding room went very quiet. Not the quiet of emptiness, the quiet of a building holding its breath. Nadia set her hands flat on the table in front of her and waited for what came next. The footsteps in the corridor weren't hurried. That was the thing Nadia noticed first. Warren didn't rush. He never rushed. She had watched him walk into rooms that were already on fire and move at exactly the same pace he moved everywhere else, measured and unhurried. The kind of deliberate calm that was not a personality trait, so much as a professional decision made long ago and never revisited. She heard that pace now, the specific rhythm of it, and something in her chest released a tension she hadn't known she was holding. Then she heard Voss. His voice was different from how it had been when he sat across from her 20 minutes ago. The managed ease was gone, replaced by something that was trying to sound like authority and landing instead as defensiveness, which was its own kind of tell. I'm not sure what federal matter you're referring to, but this isn't the procedure for... The procedure, Warren said, is that you have a federal employee in your holding room who has been arrested without cause and processed without proper documentation, and I need her out of that room in the next 3 minutes while my colleagues begin a preliminary review of your arrest logs from this morning. A pause. Then, your colleagues. There are 4 of us. We came prepared. Nadia heard the shift in the hallway noise, the sound of other presences registering, officers adjusting, the small physical language of a group of people who have just understood that the situation is not what they thought it was. Someone said something she couldn't catch. Someone else said, "Quieter, what the hell?" The door to the holding room opened. It wasn't Warren. It was Officer Malden, the young woman from the store, the one who'd been filling out paper forms at a separate desk with the look of someone trying very hard to be invisible. She looked at Nadia with an expression that was complicated in ways a face that young shouldn't have to hold. "They said you can come out," Malden said. "Thank you." Nadia stood, smoothed the front of her jacket, and walked out. The main room of the Harlow Falls Police Department was a different place than it had been when she'd been walked through it an hour and a half ago. Then it had the ambient hum of routine, officers moving at the pace of people who believe their day is ordinary, paperwork being shuffled, the coffee machine running, Roy at the front desk with his eyes on his monitor. Now it had the quality of a room in which something structural had shifted, and no one had quite processed what the new structure looked like. 3 officers stood in a loose cluster near the far wall, not talking, just standing together the way people stand when they need the proximity of familiar bodies. Cord was near the window with his arms crossed. Bruner was at his desk, and he was the only person in the room who appeared to be genuinely still. Not the stillness of calm, but the stillness of a man who has stopped moving because he doesn't know in which direction moving would help. Warren Osei was standing near the booking desk with his jacket buttoned, a leather document bag at his side, and the particular quality of presence that Nadia had spent her first 3 months at the DOJ trying to understand and eventually concluded could not be taught. He was 54, built like someone who had played football in college, and then spent the next 30 years deciding what to do with the energy. And he had a way of occupying a room that was less about dominance and more about the simple physical fact of knowing exactly why he was there. Beside him were two attorneys from the Atlanta field office, Priya Sethi and Marcus Doyle, both early 30s, both carrying the tight alertness of people on their first significant federal action, and a woman Nadia recognized as Diane Kuttner from the Civil Rights Division's Investigative Support Unit, who had a recorder of her own out and running. Voss stood a few feet away from Warren with his arms at his sides and an expression that was working very hard to stay neutral. Warren looked at Nadia when she came out. A quick, comprehensive look, checking condition, noting the cuffs had been removed, noting her posture, reading everything he needed to read in about 2 seconds. Then he looked back at Voss. "Chief Voss, I need the original arrest report filed this morning, the booking log for the past 6 hours, and the name and contact information for the store employee at Donahue's Market who initiated the shoplifting complaint." Voss's jaw shifted. "The arrest was handled by Officer Brunner. You'd need to talk to him about the specifics." "I intend to. I also intend to talk to you about the specifics, but right now I need those documents." "This is highly irregular." "It is," Warren agreed pleasantly. "Most mornings don't involve the unlawful arrest of a federal investigator midway through a 7-month civil rights case. But here we are." The words landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Nadia watched the cluster of officers near the far wall, watched the exact moment the meaning arrived in each of their faces, the small, involuntary recalibration of expression that people do when the stakes of a situation jump and they're recalculating where they stand. Ford's arms unfolded slightly. Prentice, who had been looking at his phone, stopped looking at his phone, and Brunner, at his desk, finally moved, a small, involuntary backward shift of his chair, just an inch, as though his body had responded before his mind could stop it. "Federal investigator," Voss said. "Senior Investigative Counsel, Civil Rights Division, Department of Justice." Warren set the document bag on the booking desk and unzipped it. "She's been conducting a preliminary investigation into this department for approximately 7 months. The arrest this morning is now part of that investigation." Voss looked at Nadia. She said nothing. She didn't need to. "I want a department attorney present," Voss said. "You're absolutely entitled to one," Warren said. "In the meantime, those documents." It took Roy 40 minutes to produce what Warren had asked for, partly because Roy moved slowly, and partly because there were gaps in what he was able to produce. Specifically, the booking log had an entry missing between 9:47 and 11:22 that morning that no one seemed able to account for. And the arrest report that Brunner had filed was a single page that contained 3 factual claims Nadia could refute with her own time-stamped recording and the testimony of multiple witnesses still identifiable from the store's external camera system. Warren reviewed the arrest report at the booking desk without sitting down, standing and reading the way he always read under pressure, very still, very thorough, turning pages with the patient precision of a man who understands that what a document doesn't say is as important as what it does. He read the missing time gap in the booking log without comment and wrote something in the notebook he carried in his jacket pocket. He read Brunner's description of the incident. Subject observed concealing merchandise. Subject became verbally combative. Subject refused lawful orders. And wrote something else. Priya Sethi had moved to a corner of the room and was conducting what appeared to be a quiet conversation with Officer Malden, who had not rejoined the cluster by the far wall and was instead still near the doorway to the holding corridor, still carrying that complicated expression. Nadia noted this without interfering. Priya was good at those conversations. She had a way of being very young-looking in a way that made people underestimate what she was taking in, which was, in its own way, a professional tool not unlike Nadia's plain green jacket and 10-year-old Subaru. Marcus Doyle had stepped outside to the parking lot, which meant he was making calls. From the Atlanta U.S. Attorney's Office, probably. Possibly from the FBI field coordinator they had on standby. Possibly both. Nadia asked Roy for a glass of water and got it, lukewarm, in a paper cup. She stood near the booking desk and drank it and watched the room. Brunner came to her. She hadn't expected that, but she understood it in retrospect. Men like Brunner came to you when they thought they could still manage the situation one-on-one, when they believed the thing could still be contained by direct force of personality. He walked over with the careful casualness of someone trying to look like they were not walking over with purpose, and he stopped a few feet from her, and he said, voice low, "I didn't know who you were. I know you didn't. If I'd known, it wouldn't have changed whether what you did was legal, she said. "It only would have changed whether you did it." He processed that for a moment. His jaw worked. "I was doing my job." "Tell me what job involves twisting someone's arm hard enough to bruise them before determining whether a crime occurred." He didn't answer that. "Tell me what job involves conducting a pat-down without a same-sex officer present. Tell me what job involves filing a report that doesn't name a specific stolen item because there wasn't one." She kept her voice even and quiet. "If you were doing your job, Dale, you'd have asked me for my receipt at the register and found out in 30 seconds that I hadn't taken anything." Bruner's face had gone through several things during this, and what settled on it finally wasn't anger or denial, but something that was almost worse. The flat, recessed look of a man absorbing information he knows is true but has not yet decided what to do with. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He went back to his desk. Nadia finished the water and set the cup down. Voss reappeared from the hallway that led to his private office, now with a man beside him who had the look of a local attorney, older, unhurried, carrying a briefcase that was good quality but not recent. He was the department's general counsel, probably, someone who had handled workers' comp disputes and union grievances and the occasional excessive force settlement that never saw trial. He was not a federal litigation attorney. That was visible in the way he assessed the room. The brief inventory of Warren and his team, the momentary recalibration, the slight squaring of the shoulders that was a man deciding to project confidence he wasn't entirely feeling. "My name is Harold Swick," he said. "I represent the Harlow Falls Police Department. I'd like to know what authority you're operating under." Warren handed him a document without pausing. Swick read it. His expression didn't change in any dramatic way, but the squaring of his shoulders became something slightly different. The adjustment of a man who has looked at the load-bearing wall and realized it's not what he thought it was. "This is a preliminary investigative authorization," Swick said. "It is. We're in the preliminary phase. That changes if the department fails to cooperate with document requests." "We haven't refused any requests." "The booking log is missing 95 minutes, Warren said. "That's not cooperation, that's a gap." "That may be a clerical error." "I'd like the clerk to explain it then." Swick looked at Voss. Voss looked at the middle distance. The look that passed between them was brief and legible. "This is worse than I told you, and you're going to have to deal with that." Nadia had been in enough of these rooms to know that the first hour after disclosure was never the most dramatic. The most dramatic hour came later, when the documents started talking. What the first hour looked like was exactly this: the slow, grinding reconfiguration of power in a space where power had been uncontested for a very long time. The resistance was real. But the resistance was already starting to look different than it had looked 2 hours ago, when she had been sitting in handcuffs in a grocery store, and Bruner had been certain of himself, and the camera above the booking desk had been covered with electrical tape. Marcus came back in from the parking lot. He caught Warren's eye across the room and gave a small, definitive nod. Warren's expression didn't shift, but he reached into his document bag and produced a second folder, which he handed to Swick. "This is a document preservation notice," Warren said. "Effective immediately, all records, files, digital and physical, pertaining to arrests, use of force incidents, internal complaints, and interdepartmental communications from January of the past year through present need to be preserved in their current state. Nothing is to be deleted, modified, transferred, or destroyed." Swick looked at the folder without opening it. "On what legal basis?" "The basis is an active federal civil rights investigation. If records are destroyed after receipt of this notice, we move from preliminary inquiry to obstruction." Warren finally sat down on the edge of Roy's desk, and the sitting down was itself a statement. He was settling in. He was not in a hurry. He was not leaving. "I'd encourage you to make sure Chief Voss understands that clearly." Voss understood it clearly. Nadia could see it in the way he stood. The slight shift of weight, the shoulders no longer quite where they'd been when he'd walked back in with Swick. 11 years of running this department the way he'd run it. And the thing that was unraveling it was a woman he'd dismissed on sight, processed through a system he thought was sealed, and felt confident enough about to say, "I'll have someone get you sorted," and mean it as a dismissal. It was always the ones they dismissed, Nadia thought. That was the pattern she'd seen across every case she'd worked. Not the loudest complainants, not the most threatening opponents, the ones who went quiet, the ones who got processed and moved and managed, the ones who were expected to disappear. They were the ones who came back. She asked Priya quietly how the conversation with Malden had gone. Priya kept her eyes on the room. She's willing to talk. About today? About today, and about other things. She's been with the department 8 months. She said today wasn't the first time. Nadia looked at Malden across the room, who was standing with her arms close to her sides in the particular posture of a person who has made a decision they haven't fully processed yet. Make sure she has the protection information. Already gave it to her. The afternoon went on. Swick made 3 calls from the hallway. Warren produced a third document, this one requesting personnel files for Brunner, Cord, Prentice, and Voss himself. Voss objected formally, through Swick, in language that was carefully worded and entirely predictable. Warren noted the objection in writing and said that the request was within the scope of the preliminary authorization and that any challenge would need to go through the federal district court in Macon, which they were welcome to do and which would, coincidentally, require the files to be preserved intact pending the court's review. Roy produced coffee from somewhere. Nobody took it except Diane Kuttner, who drank it without expression and kept her recorder running. At 4:17 in the afternoon, Cord asked if he was required to stay at the station. Warren said yes. Cord sat back down. At 4:49, Brunner asked to make a phone call from his desk. Warren said that was fine. Brunner picked up the desk phone, looked at it for a long moment, and then set it back down without dialing. Whatever call he'd been about to make, he'd decided against it. That decision itself, the choosing not to reach out, the recognition that there was no longer a call that would help, said more than the call would have. Nadia stepped outside at 5 o'clock, partly because she needed air, and partly because she wanted to look at the building from the outside. The afternoon light in Harlow Falls in March came in at a low angle that turned the brick buildings along Ridgeline Avenue into something that looked almost warm, almost inviting, which was the kind of irony that geography occasionally delivers without apology. She stood on the sidewalk in front of the department and looked at the gray brick and the faded flag and the bars on the lower windows that had always bothered her when she passed them. The way bars on a police station's windows communicate something about who the building is designed to keep in versus who it's designed to keep out. Marcus came out to stand beside her. He had a legal pad with notes on it, and he was reviewing them with the focused dissatisfaction of a man who has collected enough to know how much more there is. Macon office is sending 2 more people tomorrow, he said. What's the timeline on the warrant? 48 hours probably. Judge Harkins is sympathetic. She's had 2 complaints about Voss come across her desk in the last 3 years. I know. I have both of them. Nadia looked at the street. A woman was walking a dog on the other side of the road, a medium-sized mixed breed that was pulling hard on the leash toward a patch of grass near a parking meter. The woman looked up at the police department building as she passed it. A quick, reflexive look, the kind of look people give to buildings they've learned to be careful around, and then looked away just as quickly. Get me the timeline in writing when you have it. You're staying in Harlow Falls? Through the week, at minimum. Marcus nodded and went back inside. Nadia stayed on the sidewalk for another minute, watching the woman with the dog disappear around the corner. Then she went back in. Voss was in his office with Swick. The door was closed but not well fitted in its frame, and the conversation behind it was not quite inaudible. She could make out the cadence of it, the specific rhythm of 2 men working through options and finding the options narrower than they'd expected. Swick's voice was the measured one. Voss's was the one getting progressively tighter as the conversation went on, the vocal equivalent of something under pressure being compressed further. She stopped at the booking desk and picked up the original arrest report that Roy had left face up on the corner of the desk. Brunner's report, the 1-page document that described a shoplifting incident that had never happened. She read it again, which she had already read twice. The language was practiced. The details were vague in exactly the places that vagueness was useful. The claim that she had been verbally combative was in the 3rd paragraph, with no supporting quote, no witness name, no described behavior. Everything about it was designed to withstand a surface-level review while offering nothing that would survive a real one. She set it back down. She pulled out her own recorder. She'd asked to have it returned as personal property during booking, and Malden had returned it without comment, which was a small mercy that Nadia suspected was a deliberate choice rather than an oversight. And she played back the first 3 minutes of that morning's recording. Her own voice, even and specific, asking Brunner what item he claimed she'd taken. Brunner's non-answer. The sound of the customers around them, the ambient noise of a grocery store in the morning, ordinary and ordinary and ordinary, and then suddenly not. She stopped the playback and pocketed the recorder. Through the closed office door, Voss's voice had gone up another register. She caught 3 words clearly enough to be certain. How much time? Swick's response was too low to hear, then Voss again, and what she heard this time was not a question. It was the voice of a man who has been calculating exits and has just finished calculating and found that there aren't as many as he thought. She was standing near the door to the holding corridor when Maldine came out of the bathroom at the end of the hall, stopped when she saw Nadia, and didn't move for a moment. "You're staying?" Maldine said. "For now, yes." Maldine looked at the closed office door, then back at Nadia. She looked like she was 25, which she probably was, give or take. She had short hair and the kind of face that defaulted to controlled, a professional arrangement that was also, probably, a habit developed young. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "When you came in this morning, when Brunner brought you in, did you already know about all of it?" "I knew most of it." Maldine was quiet for a moment. "I filed a complaint. Internal. In November." Nadia said nothing, but she held the silence in a way that invited more. "About a stop. In the Langford district. Brunner and Cord, 2 guys they pulled over, and there was no reason for the stop that I could see. I wrote it up, gave it to the sergeant, and then..." Maldine stopped. "Nothing. Nobody said anything. 3 weeks later I got moved to day paperwork." "I know about the November complaint," Nadia said. Maldine stared at her. "You know about it?" "It's in the department's internal complaint log, which is publicly accessible under a records request, which I made in December." The stare continued, and inside it something shifted. Not surprise exactly, but the specific reconfiguration of a person who has believed for months that something they did disappeared without trace and has just been told it left a mark after all. Does that mean it? It means it's documented. What comes next depends on what you're willing to say. Maldine looked at the hallway, the floor, the office door, and then back at Nadia. "I'm willing," she said, quietly, but without hesitation. The office door opened without warning, and Voss came out alone, Swick still visible behind him through the gap. And Voss looked at the 2 of them standing in the corridor, and something crossed his face that was not quite readable. Not anger, not calculation, something rawer than either. The look of a man watching a thing he built begin its process of coming apart. He looked at Nadia for a long moment. "We'll need your recorder as evidence," he said. "My recorder is federal property related to an active investigation," she said. "You don't have standing to request it. If you believe you do, you can file with the district court in Macon." His jaw set. "Chief Voss," she kept her voice even, "I'd strongly suggest you speak with your counsel about the difference between what you can still control and what you can't. That distinction is going to matter a great deal in the next 48 hours. He stood there for 3 seconds that felt measurably longer. Then he walked past them both toward the front of the station, and his walk, the deliberate, easy pace of a man who owned the floor he was walking on, was slightly off, just slightly. A fraction of a degree of uncertainty in the gait that would have been invisible to anyone who hadn't been watching him carefully for 7 months. Nadia watched him go. Maldine let out a breath beside her, barely audible. "What happens in 48 hours?" Maldine asked. Before Nadia could answer, her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Marcus, 1 word, granted. The warrant had come through early. 48 hours had just collapsed into now, and somewhere in the Harlow Falls Police Department server room, in its filing cabinets, in the locked drawer of Voss's desk that she'd noted on her second visit and never been able to access, the things they had spent years hiding were about to stop being hidden. She put her phone in her pocket and looked at Maldine. "It already started," she said. Maldine didn't ask anything else. She read the look on Nadia's face and understood, the way people understand things when the air in a room changes faster than language can catch up with it, and she stepped back without being asked and let Nadia move. Warren was at the booking desk when Nadia came through, and she showed him the screen without saying anything. He read the single word, set the phone down on the desk between them, and picked up his own. 3 calls in the next 4 minutes. The FBI field coordinator in Atlanta, the U.S., Marshall's liaison, whose number he kept in the second page of his contacts under a first name only, and the supervising attorney at the Macon Federal Courthouse, who had processed the warrant application in under 6 hours because Judge Harkins had been waiting for exactly this kind of documentation for longer than anyone in the Harlow Falls Police Department knew. Nadia gave him the space to make the calls and walked to the far end of the booking area, near the window that looked out onto Ridgeline Avenue. The street was ordinary in the way streets are ordinary at 5 in the afternoon. A few cars moving, a woman with grocery bags walking from the direction of the parking lot 2 blocks north, the barber shop across the street turning its sign. She watched it and thought about what the next 12 hours would look like, and she thought about it the way she always thought about the operational part of these things. Not with anticipation, but with the flat, practical attention of someone running a checklist inside their head. Evidence preservation team, server access, physical files, the locked drawer in Voss's office, the secondary location, a storage unit on the east side of town that Terrence Pickett, the bail bondsman, rented under a company name that traced back to an LLC with Voss listed as a registered agent, which was the financial connection she'd been working to verify when all of this started this morning. She hadn't verified it yet, but the warrant covered it. Warren finished his calls and came to stand beside her. Marshals will be here in 90 minutes. FBI evidence team in 2 hours. I want the server room secured first. Voss has a locked drawer in his office, she said. Standard keyed lock, not electronic. Physical key is probably on his person. We'll get the locksmith authorization in the warrant backup. He looked at the street. How are you? It was a question he asked carefully. Warren, in exactly the situations where most people either didn't ask or asked too much. She had noticed this about him in the first weeks of working together, and had never entirely gotten used to it. I'm fine, she said. Your wrists. She looked at them. The bruising was there. Not dramatic, a mottled line along the left one, where the cuff had torqued during the parking lot pat-down, but visible now that the adrenaline of the first hours had settled. I'll get them looked at tomorrow. Tonight, he said. Not a request. Warren, there's an urgent care on Palmetto Street. Priya can take you after we've got the warrant execution underway. She was about to object and then didn't, because arguing with Warren about documented injury when the injury was going to appear in her formal complaint report was not a productive use of the next 90 minutes. Fine. After the server room. He nodded and went back to Doyle. Nadia turned from the window and found Brunner watching her from his desk. Not aggressively. He'd moved past aggressive somewhere in the last 2 hours, arrived at something on the other side of it that was quieter and more complicated. He was a man who had believed he was protected, and that belief was not a small thing to lose, even for someone who had earned losing it. She had seen that look on other people in other rooms and had learned to read it accurately. Not as remorse exactly, because remorse required more self-examination than this stage allowed, but as the first raw moment of understanding that the floor is gone. She didn't say anything to him. There was nothing to say that the next several months wouldn't say more clearly. At 6:12, 3 U.S. Marshals came through the front entrance of the Harlow Falls Police Department. They were not loud about it. They were not theatrical. The lead marshal, a woman named Tess Ardmore, who had worked with Warren's team before, walked in carrying a sealed document envelope and went directly to Warren, and the exchange between them took 40 seconds and consisted mostly of Ardmore handing him the envelope and Warren opening it, checking the seal documentation, and nodding. Then Ardmore turned to Roy at the front desk and said, I need you to step away from the terminal, please. And Roy, who had been sitting in the same chair for 8 hours and had the look of a man who had spent most of those hours wishing he were elsewhere, stood up with a kind of relieved resignation and moved. Voss came out of his office at the sound of the front door. He took in the 3 marshals, the sealed document, Warren with the envelope open in his hands, and Ardmore already positioning herself between him and the front desk terminal, and the thing that happened in his face was not collapse. Voss was not the kind of man who collapsed visibly, but a compression, a drawing inward, like a building whose internal frame is still standing, but whose exterior has just been removed. Gerald Voss, Warren said, this is a federal search warrant for the premises, records, servers, and personal effects associated with the Harlow Falls Police Department and its personnel, issued by the United States District Court for the Middle District of Georgia. The warrant covers all physical and digital materials pertaining to arrests, use of force, internal complaints, financial records, and interdepartmental communications from January of the preceding year through today's date. Swick stepped out of the office behind Voss with his briefcase already in his hand. He took the warrant copy Warren extended and read it with the quiet, rapid efficiency of a man who has read enough of these to know within the first 30 seconds whether there is anything in it he can challenge. There wasn't. Nadia could read that in the pace at which his eyes moved, fast at first, then slower, then fast again at the financial records clause, then stopping. The financial records section, Swick said. This extends to personal financial records? To financial records that intersect with departmental operations, Warren said, including but not limited to transactions between department personnel and third-party vendors, bondsmen, or contracted services. Yes. Swick looked at Voss. Voss was looking at the warrant. Chief Voss, Ardmore said, I need the key to your office desk. He looked up slowly. My personal property is covered under the warrant if it's located on these premises. The desk key. The pause that followed lasted approximately 5 seconds, which was long enough that Cord and Prentice, standing near the far wall, shifted their weight simultaneously in the unconscious physical mirroring of people sharing a moment of high tension. Brunner didn't move. Malden, near the corridor, watched with her arms at her sides and her face carefully arranged. Voss reached into his pants pocket and produced a key ring. He removed a small brass key and set it on the booking desk. He didn't hand it to Ardmore. He set it on the desk and moved it toward her with one finger, a gesture so precise in what it communicated. I am complying, and I want you to know that compliance is a choice I'm making, not a submission. That Nadia filed it away as a character data point, even in the middle of everything else. The FBI evidence team arrived at 6:58. There were 5 of them, 2 agents and 3 forensic technicians, carrying equipment cases with the quiet efficiency of people who do this professionally and have no interest in performing it. They went to the server room with Ardmore and didn't come out for an hour and 40 minutes. During that time, the main room of the HFPD took on the specific quality of a held breath. Officers who had been told to remain on site staying in their seats and not talking much. The civilian staff moved to the break room by Doyle, the overhead fluorescents humming the way they always hummed but sounding different somehow in the new configuration of the space. Nadia sat with Priya at a table near the window and went through her own recorded files, cross-referencing timestamps with the arrest report Brunner had filed, building the documentary chain that would be entered as federal evidence. It was meticulous work, and it was not exciting, but it was the work that mattered, the part that was not visible in any cinematic sense, but was the actual machinery of accountability, each timestamp and discrepancy and verified fact, a brick in a structure that would take months to fully assemble and could not be kicked out from under anyone once it was complete. At 8:30, one of the forensic technicians came out of the server room and spoke quietly to Warren. Warren came to Nadia. They found a deleted file archive, he said. Server-side deletion with a wipe utility, but it was run on Tuesday. Forensics is saying the recoverable data is substantial. Tuesday was 2 days ago, which meant someone in the department had known or suspected that something was coming and had run a cleanup before the warrant arrived. The specific stupidity of running a standard wipe utility on a federal-grade server and believing it would work was the kind of thing Nadia had seen before, and it never got less remarkable. The confidence of people who have never genuinely been investigated in how much they don't understand about what investigation involves. What's recoverable? Complaints log going back 4 years. Internal communications. And Warren paused in the way he paused when something was more significant than he wanted to present it casually. Financials. A separate financial ledger not connected to the department's official accounts. Transactions. Some of them matching dates with Pickett's bail receipts. The Terrence Pickett connection. The thing she'd been 3 weeks away from confirming had been sitting in a file on the department's own server, incompletely wiped, waiting. Okay, she said. Okay, he agreed. At 9:15, Voss asked to speak to Warren privately. Warren agreed with Ardmore present in Voss's office. Nadia was not in the room for this, which was appropriate. She was a witness and a party to the morning's events, and there were procedural lines that mattered here even when they were inconvenient. She waited in the corridor and listened to the quality of silence coming from the office, which told her nothing specific, but told her in general terms that whatever was happening inside it was not a short conversation, which meant Voss was talking. People talked when the alternative became clear. When there was still a thing they were protecting, that talking might protect less imperfectly than silence, they talked. Nadia had seen it many times. The silence they'd maintained for years cracked not in the moment of exposure, but in the moment when they understood the scope of what had been found. When the thing they'd hidden was no longer hidden, and they had to make a rapid calculation about what remaining silence was worth. She didn't know exactly what Voss had in his head about what was worth protecting. She suspected he had someone below him, Brunner, most probably, whom he could weight the conversation toward. That was the other thing people did. When the floor was gone, they looked for someone else's floor. Doyle came into the corridor at 9:40 and said quietly, "Cord wants to talk." Nadia looked at him. "To me?" "To anyone with a pen and a federal complaint form." He paused. "He looks like he hasn't slept in a week, and it's 9:40 on a Thursday." Cord was sitting at his desk when Nadia and Doyle came over, and he did look the way Doyle had described. The specific depletion of someone who has been holding something for a long time and has recently decided that the holding is more expensive than the alternative. He was 31, she knew from his personnel file, which put him in the department during all 6 of the incidents in her file. And he had no complaints history of his own, which was either because he'd done nothing worth complaining about or because he'd been careful, and she didn't know yet which it was. "I wasn't the one who touched her," he said, before either of them said anything. Her meaning, Nadia. "I know," Nadia said. "I have it on recording." He nodded. That seemed to settle something for him, the confirmation that the record distinguished between degrees of involvement. "The stop in November," he said. "The one in the Langford district. Malden wrote a complaint about it." "I know about that one." She was right. The stop was wrong. Brunner told me afterward that the complaint had been handled. He looked at his hands. I believed him. "Did you believe him because you thought he was telling the truth, or because it was easier?" The question landed harder than she'd intended it to, and she saw it in the way his jaw moved, but he didn't flinch away from it. "Both," he said. "Probably both." She respected the answer more than she would have respected a cleaner one. She and Doyle spent 40 minutes with Cord, and by the end of it he had given them 3 specific incidents he had witnessed directly, 2 involving Brunner and 1 involving a sergeant named Holloway, who had left the department in the fall under circumstances listed in the personnel file as voluntary retirement, but which Cord described as a managed exit after Holloway pushed back against Voss's informal quota system for stops in the Langford and Mercer districts. The quota system was not written down anywhere. It was communicated verbally in shift briefings, framed as productivity metrics, and understood by everyone in the department to mean that certain neighborhoods were expected to generate a certain volume of contact reports per week, regardless of whether the contacts had cause. Nadia wrote it down in exactly the language Cord used and had him initial each page. She stepped outside at 11 to call the urgent care on Palmetto Street, which was closed. She found a 24-hour clinic on the south side of town and drove herself there while Priya covered the station. She'd argued with Warren about the driving and won, mostly because Priya needed to be there for the ongoing evidence documentation, and the marshals were still working and Warren couldn't leave. The clinic was quiet at 11:30 on a Thursday night. 2 other patients in the waiting room, a fluorescent light in the back hallway that flickered with a slow, irregular rhythm that the staff had clearly stopped noticing. The nurse who looked at her wrists was named Peggy, 50s, efficient and unhurried. She noted the bruising, asked how it happened, and Nadia said it happened during an unlawful arrest. And Peggy looked at her for a moment with the particular stillness of someone deciding whether to ask more and deciding against it. "Both wrists?" Peggy asked. "Primarily the left." Peggy documented it, took photographs, gave her an ice pack and a form, and said there was soft tissue bruising consistent with the mechanism described and that she should follow up in a week. The photographs and the form would become evidence. Nadia signed the release and drove back to the station. It was 12:40 in the morning when the forensics team came out of the server room with their cases packed, and their lead technician, a man named Reuben Hart, told Warren that they had successfully imaged the drives and that preliminary analysis confirmed recoverable data sufficient for the investigation's purposes, and that the deleted financial ledger was intact enough that 47 individual transactions were legible with corresponding dates and amounts. 47. The same number as the incidents in her file, which was probably coincidence and probably wasn't. Warren called the Atlanta field office. Nadia called her direct supervisor's cell, a woman named Calloway, who picked up on the fourth ring and listened without interrupting while Nadia gave her the 60-second version and then said, "Get some sleep if you can," which was Calloway's version of "well done." At 1:15 in the morning, Voss came out of his office. The conversation with Warren had ended 2 hours ago, but he'd stayed inside, and the door had been closed, and no one had gone in. He looked, coming out, like a man who had spent 2 hours sitting alone in a room he had controlled for 11 years and understanding for the first time what the room looked like from the other side of that control. He looked at Nadia across the booking area. She was at the table by the window where she'd been most of the night, working. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. He went to the break room, and she heard the sound of a cup being filled from the sink, and then the sound of him sitting down on what was probably the plastic chair by the door, because it made a sound the other chairs didn't. Brunner was still at his desk. He'd been there for 7 hours. Priya had brought him a paper cup of water at some point, which he'd drunk without acknowledging. He had not asked to make another phone call. He had not spoken to Cord or Prentice or anyone else. He had sat at his desk with his hands in his lap and his eyes either on the surface of the desk or on a point on the far wall that did not correspond to anything visible. And Nadia had checked on him periodically, not out of sympathy, but out of the practical caution that people in his situation sometimes make decisions that create secondary problems. At 1:50, he stood up. Every set of eyes in the room tracked him. Not overtly, but tracked him. He walked to the booking desk and stood in front of Ardmore, who had been reading something on her phone and put it down when she saw him coming. "I want to make a statement," Brunner said. Ardmore looked at him evenly. "You have the right to have an attorney present." "I know my rights." "Do you want to exercise them?" He thought about it. "No." "Then I'll need you to confirm, on the record, that you're making this statement voluntarily without counsel, and that you understand that anything you say can be used in a federal proceeding." "I understand," Ardmore called Doyle over. She set up the digital recorder on the desk between them and stated the time, the date, the location, and the parties present. Then she said, "Mr. Brunner, whenever you're ready." He was quiet for about 10 seconds. Then he said, "The arrest this morning was Voss's call." The room held its breath. I made the stop. That was me. But Voss had told us 3 weeks ago that the woman in the green jacket had been seen asking questions at the courthouse and at the Donahue's Market area. He said she was a problem. He said if she came through, we should find a reason. Brunner's voice was flat, not performatively remorseful, just flat, like he was reading from a document. "I didn't know she was federal. I want that on record. I didn't know." "What happened after the stop?" Doyle said. "I called Voss from the parking lot before we drove back. He told me to process her through, file a standard shoplifting report, and he'd take care of the rest." A pause. "I asked him what the rest meant." "What did he say?" Brunner looked at the recorder. "He said, people like her move on when there's nothing to move on about. He said he'd done it before." The silence after this was not the silence of a room that didn't know what to do with what it had heard. It was the silence of a room that knew exactly what it had heard and was processing the specific weight of it. Not just the morning, not just Nadia, but people like her, and he'd done it before. The casual fluency of a man describing a practice, not an incident. Nadia kept her face still. She wrote 11 words. VB statement re-pattern, Brunner reckon, in her notebook, and underlined it once. The statement went on for another 35 minutes. Cord added to his own statement twice in that period. Each time after something Brunner said prompted a specific memory, and by the time the recordings were sealed and the documentation was complete, the case had shifted from a 7-month investigation into a department's historical patterns, into something more immediate and more serious. A documented conspiracy to obstruct a federal investigation, coordinated by the department's chief, executed by his officers, and now confirmed by 2 of those officers' own words. It was 3 in the morning. Most of the lights in the station were still on. The coffee machine in the break room had been refilled twice. Warren found Nadia at the window table and sat down across from her with the expression of a man who has been awake for 20 hours and is running purely on the structural momentum of the work. "We have enough for charges," he said. "Yes. Conspiracy, civil rights violations, obstruction, Voss, Brunner at minimum. Possibly Cord, though his cooperation will factor. The financial ledger. Yes. The Pickett connection is going to add fraud to the list." He rubbed the bridge of his nose. "I'm going to need you to write up a full account of this morning for the formal complaint record, time-stamped, everything. I'll have it done by 6. Nadia." He looked at her. "You're not required to be the one who does all of this tonight. I know. But you're going to anyway. I have the timestamps memorized. Someone else writes it. They have to ask me everything. It's faster." He accepted this because it was true. He stood up, collected his notebook, and stopped. "Voss hasn't asked for his attorney back." She looked up. "Since when?" "Since Swick left at 11. Voss is still in the break room. Swick called him twice in the last hour, and he didn't pick up." Warren's expression was careful. "I don't know what that means." She thought about Brunner's statement. He said he'd done it before. She thought about Voss in his office for 2 hours after his conversation with Warren, sitting alone in the dark in a room he'd run for 11 years. She thought about the key on the booking desk, moved with one finger, and the specific controlled quality of a man making sure that even surrendering something was done on his own terms. "It means he's calculating," she said. "He's deciding what he has left to bargain with." Warren nodded slowly. "Or he's decided there isn't anything." Either way, she thought. Either way, the night was going somewhere she couldn't fully predict yet, which was the part of this work that required you to stay alert past the point where alertness felt natural. Because the moment you assumed you knew how something would end was the moment something happened that you hadn't accounted for. At 3:47, Roy came out of the break room and said that Chief Voss wasn't there. Ardmore was up first, and Doyle was on his phone before Ardmore reached the break room doorway. The back window of the break room was open, standard casement window, unlocked, looking out onto the rear parking lot of the building. The rear parking lot had a chain-link gate on the south side that opened onto a service alley, and the service alley connected to a side street that ran 3 blocks east before intersecting with the state highway. Voss's personal vehicle, a silver Ford pickup registered in his name, was not in the rear lot. It had been there at midnight. Ardmore confirmed this from the marshal's own parking log, which they maintained as standard practice during a warrant execution. Gerald Voss, chief of the Harlow Falls Police Department, 11 years in the position, 61 years old, with a son in the department and a brother-in-law on the county commission, and 47 transactions in a hidden financial ledger that forensics had spent the night recovering, had gone out the break room window sometime in the previous hour, gotten in his truck, and driven away. Nadia stood in the break room doorway looking at the open window. The night air came through it, cool and carrying the faint smell of pine from somewhere past the service road. She looked at the chair by the door, the plastic one that made the sound the others didn't, which had been moved slightly from where it normally sat, turned at a small angle toward the window rather than the door. He'd planned it. Not in the last hour, in the last several hours, maybe since the forensics team came out of the server room, maybe since Brunner started talking. He'd sat in his office calculating, and what he'd concluded was not that there was something left to bargain with. He'd concluded that there wasn't. Doyle was already on with the state patrol. Ardmore was coordinating with the FBI field coordinator. Warren was pulling up the vehicle registration on his phone. Nadia looked at the open window for another moment. The pine smell, the cool air, the dark. She had been in this town for 7 months, and she had spent those months building something airtight, and it was airtight, and the man who had ordered her arrested this morning had just climbed out of a window in the middle of the night, which was not the action of a man who believed he could survive what was coming. It was the action of a man who knew exactly how well she'd built it. She turned back to the room. "I need the highway camera contacts for the county," she said. "And someone get me the location of Terrence Pickett's registered address." She had been building a case about a police department, and somewhere in the architecture of that case, without fully registering it until this moment in a dark motel room with the parking lot light humming outside, it had become a case about 4 specific people who were sitting somewhere tonight, in a cell, or on parole, or carrying a conviction record that followed them into every job application and housing form and background check, because a man named Gerald Voss had run a system that needed bodies to generate revenue, and had not cared whose bodies they were. She did not sleep for another hour. When she did, it was the thin, incomplete sleep of someone whose mind has found something it cannot set down, and she woke at 5:40 before the alarm and lay still for a moment, and then got up. The names Doyle had promised were in her email by 6:50. 4 defendants, 4 cases. She read each name carefully and wrote them in her notebook. Darnell Fry, Marcus Obi, Leanne Tatum, Calvin Pruitt, and beside each name she wrote the year of arrest, the charge, and the current status as Doyle had pulled it from the State Corrections database. Fry, convicted 2020, currently serving a 4-year sentence for drug possession with intent to distribute. Obi, convicted 2019, released on parole in 2022, parole active. Tatum, convicted 2021, sentence completed, living in Valdosta. Pruitt, convicted 2020, currently serving, eligible for parole review in 8 months. She read the public defender flags next. They were thorough, professionally done, the work of someone who had seen something wrong and documented it carefully and then sent it into a process that had absorbed it without response. The flags raised specific questions about the integrity of the arrest reports in each case, questions about timing, about the specificity of the probable cause stated, about evidence chain of custody in 2 of the cases. They were not accusations. They were questions that required answers that no one had provided. She called Dorothea Finch at 6:30. Finch picked up on the 3rd ring, which meant she was already awake, which meant she had probably heard something from the Harlow Falls Community Network, which ran faster than any official notification system. "I heard they arrested Voss," Finch said without preamble. "Last night, formal charges yesterday afternoon." "And Brunner?" "Charged yesterday morning." Finch was quiet for a moment. Nadia had met her in person twice. A woman in her early 60s, sharp and careful, and carrying the specific emotional density of someone who had been doing civil rights work long enough to have learned not to celebrate anything before it was fully done. "What do you need from me?" "I have 4 names I need you to look at. Former defendants. The public defender's office flagged their cases in 2021. "I know about those cases." Nadia stopped. "You know about them?" "I included them in the binder I sent to the DOJ." A pause, the particular pause of a woman who has been waiting to be asked this question for longer than she should have had to wait. Page 41. The defendants section. I cross-referenced them with Pickett's bail records. Nadia set the phone down on the nightstand for exactly 2 seconds, thinking about the binder. The 2-inch binder that Warren had slid across his desk to her last year on a Wednesday morning, which she had read cover to cover, which she had used as the foundation of her investigation, which she had known well enough to quote in her warrant applications. Page 41. She picked the phone back up. "I need to look at the binder again. I'll send you the digital copy." "Dorothea." She paused. "I'm sorry about page 41. Another pause, longer. "The whole point," Finch said carefully, "is that you're looking at it now." The digital binder arrived in Nadia's inbox at 6:52. She opened page 41 on her phone and read it standing in the motel room in yesterday's clothes with the morning light coming in flat under the curtains. And she read it with the specific quality of attention she reserved for moments when she was understanding that she had missed something. Not failed, not been negligent, but moved through a document with a focus that had been so precisely directed toward the pattern of institutional behavior that it had not fully landed on the 4 individuals within the pattern. The binder's defendant section was 5 pages. It named the 4 cases, the public defender flags, the Pickett bail records cross-reference, and included a note in Finch's handwriting in the margin of the printed copy that said, "These 4 need a lawyer." Nadia had been that lawyer in the broad sense for 7 months. But she had been looking at the institution, and these 4 had been inside the institution, and the difference between those 2 perspectives was not abstract. It was Darnell Fry, currently in a Georgia State Correctional Facility, 4 years for a charge whose probable cause statement Pickett had been notified of before Fry was arrested. She called Warren at 7. "I'm already on with Price," he said when he picked up. She saw Doyle's phone record cross-match last night. The binder has a defendant section, page 41. Finch included the 4 cases. She cross-referenced them with Pickett's bail records before she sent us the file. A silence. Then, "I need to look at that section again." "Yes." "Nadia, I know. We didn't miss the institution. We got the institution, but I know what we need to do next. His voice was the voice of a man absorbing something and converting it immediately into action, which was the quality that made him good at this. Price is filing a formal motion for case review on the 4 defendants by end of day. I'll make sure she has the binder section. The motion needs to include immediate status review for Fry and Prewitt. They're still incarcerated. I'll tell her, come to the station. She came to the station. It was 7:40 when she arrived, and the building had the quality that police departments sometimes had the morning after something significant. A flatness, a recalibration, the ambient noise of people moving through a space whose hierarchy had been completely reorganized in the past 20 hours. 3 officers she didn't know by name were at their desks doing paperwork, moving through their routine with the careful attention of people who are being watched and know it. The FBI evidence team's equipment was gone. Roy was at the front desk. The camera above the booking area still had a ghost outline where the electrical tape had been removed. Malden was there. Not in uniform, in jeans and a grop, sitting at the table near the window that had been Nadia's table all night, with a cup of coffee from somewhere and a legal pad in front of her with writing on it that Nadia, passing, could see was a list of names. "Officer Malden," Nadia said. "Cora," Malden said. "You can call me Cora." Nadia sat across from her. The legal pad had 12 names on it. "What's this?" "Officers who I think will cooperate with the investigation." Malden, Cora, looked at the list and then at Nadia. "And 2 who I don't think will, but who I think have information. I don't know what to do with the distinction." "That's our job to work out, not yours." "I know, She stopped, started again. "I've been here for 8 months, and I've been watching things happen and not doing enough about them, and I want to do something now that's actually useful, even if it's just a list." Nadia looked at the 12 names. "This is useful," she said. Cora nodded, and the nod had the slightly unsteady quality of someone who has been running on adrenaline and righteousness and is starting to feel the exhaustion underneath. "What happens to the department? Like, operationally, while all of this is going on?" "The county sheriff's office will assume interim jurisdiction for emergency response. State oversight will handle the administrative review. There will be a federal monitor assigned within 30 days, probably. And the officers who aren't charged. They'll be reviewed individually. Some will be cleared, some won't." "What about me?" Nadia looked at her directly. "Your internal complaint from November is documented and will be entered into the formal record as evidence of the suppression pattern. Your cooperation with this investigation will be in the record. I can't tell you what any review board will do with that, but I can tell you that the record will say you tried." Cora looked at her coffee cup. "That's not a clean answer." "No," Nadia agreed. "It's not." Jevon Price arrived at 9, and the morning became about the case review motion. Price had drafted it overnight. She was the kind of attorney who drafted things at 2 in the morning and then reviewed them fresh at dawn and revised them before the first meeting of the day. And she and Nadia went through it together at the conference table that had been set up in the station's small training room, which was the only space with enough table surface to spread documents. The motion was 40 pages. It was specific, citation-heavy, and structured around the phone record cross-match as the direct evidentiary link between the department's arrest and notify system and the 4 wrongful conviction cases. "Fry's counsel," Price said, near the end of the review. "His public defender from 2020 is still practicing?" "Finch confirmed it this morning. She's already reached out." "Good. We need independent counsel on the defendant review so there's no appearance of the prosecution managing the remedy." Price made a note. "Tatum and Obi are out. Jasmine, their review is more straightforward. It's a record correction and parole modification situation. The active incarceration cases are the priority." "Fry and Prewitt." "Yes. I'm filing an emergency status motion for both of them alongside the case review. I want them flagged for immediate facility review. I don't want them sitting in the system while paperwork processes." This was the part of Price's work that Nadia found most worth watching, the way she treated urgency as a technical problem to solve rather than an emotional state to manage. The motion would go to a federal judge. The judge would issue an order. The order would move through the corrections system. None of it was fast, but Price built timelines that compressed it as much as law allowed. And she did so without drama, just with the relentless practical architecture of someone who had learned that urgency without precision helped no one. They filed the motion at 11:47. Nadia sat in the training room after Price left and looked at the walls, which had a whiteboard with old training notes on it from what looked like a de-escalation seminar. The marker mostly faded, and she thought about de-escalation seminars in a department where Voss had been running a quota system and suppressing complaints for 4 years, and the specific futility of professional development as a patch on a structural wound. Doyle knocked and came in. The county commissioner's office called. She looked up. "Which commissioner?" "Acting chair. They want a briefing." He paused. "Voss's brother-in-law stepped down this morning." She sat up straighter. "Voluntarily?" His office put out a statement. "Personal reasons. Effective immediately." Voluntary resignation under these circumstances was either guilt management or political survival, and it didn't much matter which because the effect was the same. The network that had protected the HFPD was shedding its most visible limbs before the investigation reached them. That was useful in one way and complicated in another, because it meant people were calculating their exposure and making moves, and moves made by people calculating their exposure needed to be tracked. "I want the statement," she said, "already in your email. And I want a list of any county-level decisions over the past 4 years that touched HFPD budget, forfeiture accounts, or personnel reviews." "That's a broader records request." "I know. File it today." He left. She looked at the whiteboard and its faded de-escalation notes for another moment, then picked up her phone and called Calloway. "Atlanta is watching this closely," Calloway said before Nadia could start. "The case review motion is getting attention from the division director." "The motion is Price's work. The investigation is yours. The motion exists because of 7 months of yours." A pause. "I also want to say, the arrest yesterday, the way you handled it. You held the line and you kept recording and you didn't break cover before the time was right. That's the job done correctly under pressure." Calloway was not a person who offered praise lightly or at length, and she didn't now. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine." "That's not what I'm asking." Nadia looked at her left wrist. The bruising had moved through purple into something almost yellow at the edges, which meant it was deep and would take a while. "I found the 4 defendants last night," she said. "The ones in the binder that I didn't prioritize." "You had an institutional scope." "I know." "Nadia, the institution is why the 4 defendants happened. You got the institution." "I know," she said again. She did know it. She also knew the difference between the institution as an abstract problem and Darnell Fry's name in a corrections database. And that difference lived somewhere in her chest, in a way that was not useful and not going away, and would probably not go away for a while, which was fine. It was the kind of thing that was supposed to not go away. She spent the afternoon at the station, working through the document archive with Priya, building the evidentiary timeline that would support Price's prosecution. It was detailed, granular, unglamorous work, cross-referencing dates across 4 separate document sets, checking chains of custody, flagging inconsistencies for follow-up. The kind of work that looked nothing like what people pictured when they pictured a federal investigation and was the actual substance of it. Priya was meticulous and quiet and had a habit of catching things on second pass that she'd let go on first, which Nadia had learned to trust. And twice that afternoon, Priya said, "Wait," and circled something, and both times the circle mattered. At 3:15, Voss's attorney filed a formal response to the charges. It was 8 pages and asserted that the financial transactions had been authorized through proper channels, that the communications with Pickett were within normal operational parameters, and that the arrest of the federal investigator had been a good faith error based on information from a civilian store employee. The store employee angle was the one Nadia had been expecting. It was the only piece of the morning she hadn't fully locked down, because no Donahue's market loss prevention report had ever materialized, which meant the claim of a civilian complaint was either fabricated or based on a verbal report that no one had formally recorded. She noted the argument in her response memo and flagged it for Price. Price called it 4. "The store employee argument," she said. "I know. Donahue's Market has a security footage archive on a 48-hour rolling system. It would have recorded over by now." "I know. However," Price's voice had the specific quality of someone about to lay down something they've been holding carefully. "The teenager in the store. The one recording on his phone. His name is Jalen Oates, 17. His mother called the county courthouse this morning. She said he recorded the arrest and he'd been waiting to know if it was relevant to anything. A pause. Jalen's video runs 4 minutes and 11 seconds. It starts approximately 40 seconds before Officer Brunner made contact with you. It shows you in the bread aisle with a basket. It shows Brunner approaching. It shows the full interaction, including the shoulder grab, the refusal to name a specific stolen item, the backup being called, and the handcuffing. Nadia was quiet for a moment. He kept the video. His mother told him not to delete anything that might be important. She thought about Jalen Oates, 17, standing near the freezer section with his phone held low near his hip, watching something happening that he recognized as wrong and making a decision to document it, and then going home and keeping it for 24 hours because his mother said to hold on to things that might matter. Tell his mother he did the right thing, Nadia said. I'll tell both of them. The video arrived in Price's formal evidence file at 4:50. Nadia watched it once, in the training room, alone, on Doyle's laptop. It was shaky, and the angle was imperfect, and the audio had the ambient noise of a grocery store layered over it, and it showed clearly and completely a woman standing in a bread aisle with a basket of items she intended to purchase, approached without cause, grabbed, questioned without basis, and arrested in front of 30 people by a man who could not name the item he claimed she'd stolen because no such item existed. It was 4 minutes and 11 seconds of what had happened, seen from outside herself. And it was strange to watch, not painful, exactly, but with a quality of strangeness that came from the disconnect between the internal experience of those minutes, which had been controlled in cataloging and deliberate, and the external view of them, which showed a woman being publicly humiliated by someone who believed she had no recourse. She closed the laptop. The video eliminated the store employee argument. Without a documented complaint from Donahue's Market, and with a 4-minute video showing no shoplifting behavior whatsoever, the defense's central good faith premise had no foundation. Price would not say this to her directly because Price was careful about pre-trial communications, but Nadia knew it, and Price knew she knew it. At 6 in the evening, she walked the length of Ridgeline Avenue for the first time since she'd been arrested on it the previous morning. It was still light. March evenings in Georgia stretched, the light lingering past when you expected it. And the street looked the same as it always had. The barber shops, the hardware store, Paulette's diner with its neon sign. The police department building sitting at the far end with the gray brick and the faded flag. She stopped in front of Paulette's and went in and sat at the counter and ordered eggs and coffee and ate them alone without her notebook out, which was something she rarely did. Just ate, just sat there, in a diner in a town she'd been coming to for 7 months. The town where she'd been arrested yesterday morning in a grocery store. The town whose police department was now under federal investigation and whose chief was in a detention center and whose 4 wrongful conviction cases were under emergency judicial review. The woman behind the counter, Paulette herself, or someone who'd worked there long enough to have the same easy ownership of the space, refilled her coffee without being asked. "You're the federal woman," she said. Not hostile. Observational. "Yes." "From the thing yesterday?" "Yes." Paulette, or the woman who moved like her, looked at her for a moment with the calibrated assessment of a woman who has run a counter long enough to read people quickly. "You want anything else?" "No, thank you. This is good." She left a 20 on the counter and walked back to the station. The evening's work was quieter than the previous night, but not less consequential. Price's team processed the Jalen Oates video into evidence. The county commissioner's acting chair received a preliminary briefing from Warren, which Nadia was present for in the capacity of investigative record, and the acting chair, a woman named Beverly Sutton, who had taken the position 2 hours after the brother-in-law resigned and who had the look of someone who had been expecting a call like this and had been dreading it, asked 3 specific questions, all of them about the department's operational continuity and the protection of Harlow Falls residents during the transition period. Warren answered them directly. He did not offer comfort that wasn't warranted. Sutton accepted this and said she would coordinate with the county sheriff's office and issued a brief public statement at 8 that evening, acknowledging that the Harlow Falls Police Department was under federal investigation and that county emergency services would provide interim coverage. The public statement ran on the local news at 8:30. Nadia watched it on someone's phone, Doyle's, propped against a coffee cup on the conference table, and then went back to the documents. At 9:47, Warren came into the training room where she was working and sat across from her and put a single sheet of paper on the table between them. It was a handwritten letter, 2 pages clipped together. It had been collected from the storage unit that morning as part of the physical evidence and had been logged and photographed and was now in the formal evidence file, and Warren had flagged it and printed it. A copy, not the original, because he wanted her to read it. The letter was from a woman named Sandra Fry. It was addressed to the Harlow Falls Police Department. It was dated 14 months ago. It was a complaint letter describing a traffic stop, a search, and an arrest that she believed had been conducted without legitimate cause against her son, Darnell, and asking the department to review the circumstances of the arrest and provide documentation of the probable cause. The letter was 4 paragraphs. It was written carefully, in the language of someone who was not a lawyer but who had done their best to be precise and specific. The last paragraph said, "I am his mother, and I know my son, and I know what this is. Please tell me someone is going to look at this." The letter had been in Gerald Voss's storage unit, in the box with the other 22 complaints. It had never been entered into any system. No one from the HFPD had ever responded. Nadia read it twice. She set it back on the table and looked at it for a moment. "Sandra Fry," she said. "We have a contact address from the original letter. She's still in Harlow Falls." Nadia looked up at Warren. "Someone needs to call her." Yes. Tonight." "Yes," Warren said again. He looked at her steadily. "I thought you'd want to know before we did." She looked back at the letter. 14 months ago, a woman had written 4 careful paragraphs to the institution that had taken her son, asking for someone to look at it, and the letter had gone into a box in a storage unit on Culver Lane, and Sandra Fry had gone home and waited for a response that never came, and Darnell Fry had kept serving his sentence. She picked up her phone. "I'll make the call," she said. Warren didn't argue. He stood up and left her with the letter and the phone and the quiet of the training room, and she sat for a moment with the letter in front of her before dialing, because Sandra Fry had written 4 paragraphs to a building that had put them in a box, and the least this moment deserved was a second of stillness before it became something different. She dialed. It rang twice. "Hello?" A woman's voice, cautious, the late evening caution of someone receiving an unknown number after 9 at night. "Ms. Fry," Nadia said, "my name is Nadia Reeves. I'm with the Department of Justice. I'm calling about your son." The silence on the other end of the line lasted 3 seconds. Then Sandra Fry said, her voice shifting into something that was not quite a sound any single word could describe, "Somebody finally read it." Nadia pressed the phone to her ear. Outside the training room window, Ridgeline Avenue was dark and quiet, the faded flag moving slightly in a wind that had come up in the last hour. Tomorrow there would be more documents, more depositions, more of the procedural machinery that turned evidence into accountability, and the day after that there would be more still, and the case would move through its stages with the grinding, necessary slowness of systems built for permanence rather than speed. But right now, on the phone, Sandra Fry was talking, and Nadia was listening, and the letter that had gone into a box 14 months ago had finally arrived. Sandra Fry talked for 41 minutes. Nadia did not interrupt her. She took notes in her notebook with the phone pressed to her ear, writing names and dates and the specific details that Sandra had been carrying alone for 14 months. The night of the arrest, the officer who wouldn't meet her eyes at the station, the public defender she'd reached 3 weeks after Darnell's conviction, who had listened and flagged the case and then gone quiet, the letters she'd sent and the calls she'd made and the doors that had opened just far enough to let her see inside before closing again. Sandra's voice moved through the story with the cadence of a woman who had told it many times in her head and never once to the right person, and she didn't cry, which Nadia noticed and respected. She was past the crying, into the harder territory of sustained grief that is calcified into something like endurance. Near the end, Sandra said, "Is he coming home?" Nadia looked at the letter on the table in front of her. "Ms. Fry, I can't make you a promise about timing. What I can tell you is that his case is under emergency judicial review as of today. The motion was filed this afternoon. A judge will review it within 72 hours. "That's not what I asked." "No," Nadia said. "It's not." She paused. "Based on what we have, based on what the evidence shows about how his arrest was generated, yes, I believe he's coming home." Sandra Fry did not respond immediately. The silence on the line was not emptiness. It was the silence of a woman receiving something she had stopped believing she would receive, and the receiving of it requiring a moment that had no word for it. "Okay," Sandra said finally. "Just that. Okay." They talked for 5 more minutes about the process. What to expect, who would contact her from the public defender's office, what the case review meant in practical terms. Nadia gave her a direct number and told her to call if anything was unclear or if she didn't hear from someone within 48 hours. Sandra wrote it down. Nadia could hear the sound of the pen. When she hung up, the training room was very quiet. She sat with the letter and her notebook and her left wrist aching its dull, persistent ache, and thought about the difference between the case she had started 7 months ago and the case it had become. She had started with a pattern. She was ending with people. The pattern had always contained the people, but the people had been statistical until Sandra Fry said, "Okay," in a voice that made 14 months of waiting audible in 2 syllables. She went home to the motel and slept for 6 hours, which was the most she'd slept in 2 days, and woke feeling not rested but stable, which was enough. The next 3 weeks were the compressed, intense work of a federal case finding its procedural stride. Price's team handled the prosecution track while Nadia's team handled the investigative documentation that would support it, and the 2 tracks moved in parallel with the kind of choreography that looked seamless from outside and was, from inside, a constant negotiation of information flow and sequencing and the occasional disagreement about emphasis that required Warren to sit in a room with both of them and hear both arguments and make a call. He was good at this. He made the calls without ego and documented his reasoning and moved on, which was the reason Nadia had chosen to work under him 7 years ago and had not stopped. The federal grand jury was convened in the 3rd week. The charges against Voss, when formally presented, were broader than the original arraignment. The grand jury indicted him on 9 counts, including civil rights conspiracy, fraud, obstruction of justice, abuse of authority, and 2 counts of wire fraud connected to the financial transfers through Pickett's business. Pickett himself was indicted on 5 counts. Brunner faced 4. 2 additional officers whose names had emerged from the voluntary cooperation process, the ones Cora Malden had identified, were charged with lesser counts of civil rights violation and evidence falsification in specific cases. The indictments were announced on a Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, the local news had the story. By Thursday evening, a national wire service had picked it up, and by Friday morning, it was on 2 national network morning programs, described in the particular flattened shorthand of broadcast news that turned 14 months of work into a 90-second segment with the headline, "Federal Investigator Arrested. Mid-Investigation. Police Chief Among Those Indicted." Nadia did not watch the coverage. She had a policy about this that she had developed over years and still believed in. The coverage was for the public, and the public needed it, but watching it while the work was still ongoing created a narrative pressure that distorted judgment. She knew from Priya, who did watch it, that the coverage was substantive by television standards, and she knew from Calloway that the division director had sent a memo commending the investigation, which Calloway forwarded with a single-line note that said, "Well done, now finish it." She intended to finish it. The case review hearing for Darnell Fry was held 22 days after the indictments. It was in federal court in Macon, before a judge named Theodora Birch, who had the reputation of running a precise courtroom and having no patience for procedural theater. Fry's independent counsel, a woman named Arez Ola, who had taken the case pro bono after Finch made the referral, presented the evidence in 4 structured arguments: the pre-arrest communication between Voss and Pickett, the probable cause statement's internal inconsistencies, the public defender's original flag from 2021, and the financial ledger entries corresponding to the dates of Fry's arrest and Pickett's subsequent bail receipt. Nadia was present as the investigating federal counsel, sitting at the government table beside Price. She was not required to testify at this hearing. The documentary evidence was sufficient. But she was there because Sandra Fry was in the gallery, in the 3rd row, in a dark blue dress, with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the front of the room, with the concentrated stillness of a woman who had learned to hold herself very carefully in spaces that had the power to hurt her. The hearing lasted 3 hours. Judge Birch asked pointed questions of both the government and the defense, and the state's attorney who had prosecuted Fry's original case was present and offered, to his credit, a measured acknowledgement that the newly presented evidence materially undermined the integrity of the original conviction. He did not perform remorse. He was a professional doing a hard thing professionally, which was more than Nadia had expected. At the end of the 3 hours, Judge Birch said, "Based on the evidence presented, the court finds that the probable cause underlying the 2020 arrest was generated through a coordinated process involving the arresting officer and a third-party financial beneficiary, and that this process constitutes a fundamental violation of the defendant's Fourth Amendment rights. The conviction is vacated. The sentence is terminated effective immediately. The defendant is to be released from custody within 24 hours pending completion of the administrative processing." The gallery did not make a sound. Then Sandra Fry made a sound that was not a cry and not a word and not anything that had a name. And it was the only sound in the courtroom for a long moment, and Judge Birch looked at the gallery and did not call for order, which was itself a kind of statement. Nadia looked at the table in front of her. Price was writing something on her legal pad. Araez Ola, across the room, was leaning toward her client, and her client, a man Nadia had never met, who was currently in a holding area waiting for the hearing's outcome, was about to be told that after 5 years of a sentence built on a fabricated arrest, a judge had said the words that said it should not have happened. She thought about Sandra Fry writing 4 paragraphs. She thought about the box in the storage unit. She thought about the letter arriving 14 months late. She thought, it is not fast enough. It is never fast enough. And it has to happen anyway. And it did happen, and here it is. Calvin Pruitt's review was heard 2 weeks later, before the same judge, with a similar outcome. Leanne Tatum and Marcus Obi, whose sentences were completed, received formal findings that their convictions had been tainted by the same mechanism, with recommendations for record expungement and formal notifications to prospective employers and housing authorities. The 22 complainants from the storage box were each contacted by a member of Price's team, offered case reviews, and provided with referrals to independent counsel. 16 of the 22 had complaints that had bearing on civil rights claims that could be pursued. The other 6 had situations that were more complex, where the department's suppression of the complaint had caused harm that was harder to remediate through legal process, but where formal acknowledgement, an official federal finding that their complaint had been received and deliberately buried, was something they had not had before and now did. Gloria Chance, the retired postal worker who had sat on her porch and watched Elroy Sadler get arrested for standing on the sidewalk outside his own house, called Nadia directly when she heard the indictments had been announced. She called on a Saturday morning. "I want you to know," Gloria said, "I told my daughter, back when you first came to talk to me. I said, this woman is going to do something about it. And my daughter said, Mama, nobody does anything about it. And I said, we'll see." "How is your daughter?" Nadia asked. "She's watching the news right now, eating crow." A pause, and then a laugh that was short and genuine. "She's also real proud. I just won't tell her that part yet." Nadia smiled. She was sitting in her Atlanta apartment for the first time in 3 weeks, on a Sunday, with coffee and the window open and the case file still in the bag she hadn't fully unpacked. "Tell her when you're ready." "I will." Gloria paused. "You doing okay?" "I'm getting there." "Good. That's the right answer. Not I'm fine. I'm getting there. That's honest." She thought about that after the call. "I'm getting there." She had said it because it was true, and it was true because the case was not fully finished, would not be fully finished until the trials ran their course, until the sentencing was complete, until the 4 defendants had their records corrected in every system that held them, and the part of her that was connected to the case was still running even when she was sitting still. This was not something she could turn off and had stopped trying to. The work lived in her while it was ongoing, and the only thing to do was to make sure she lived in something else too, which she was doing imperfectly and intentionally. She unpacked the bag on Sunday evening and went back to the Atlanta office on Monday. The trials began 8 weeks later. Voss and Brunner were tried separately, which Price had argued for and won on grounds of conflicting defense strategies. Brunner's attorney had been signaling a cooperation angle since week 3, and a joint trial would have created procedural complications that benefited no one except the defense. Brunner went first. His trial lasted 6 days. His attorney presented the cooperation argument in the opening statement, describing Brunner as a man who had operated within a system he did not create and who had chosen to tell the truth when given the opportunity. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. They returned a verdict of guilty on 3 of 4 counts. The 4th count, the conspiracy charge, was reduced on a lesser-included offense finding. His attorney framed this as a victory, Price framed it, in the post-verdict briefing, as consistent with the evidence and the jury's reasonable assessment of Brunner's degree of agency within the overall scheme, which was less than Voss's but not absent. Brunner was sentenced to 4 years and 8 months. He would serve it in a federal facility. He was 46 years old. Voss's trial began 3 weeks after Brunner's verdict. It was longer and more complex. 9 counts, a defense that contested the financial records interpretation and argued that the communications with Pickett were within the range of normal professional relationships between a police department and a bail bondsman, which was an argument that required the jury to believe that 63 phone contacts, including 31, in the 48 hours preceding specific arrests were unremarkable. The jury did not believe this. They deliberated for 8 days, which was thorough rather than uncertain, and returned guilty verdicts on 7 of 9 counts. Gerald Voss was sentenced to 14 years. He stood for the sentencing without expression, which was in its way consistent with everything Nadia had observed about him. The deliberate control, the refusal to let anything show that he hadn't decided to show. The judge, in the sentencing statement, said that the duration reflected not only the crimes committed, but the systematic nature of them, the sustained and deliberate effort over years to turn a public institution into a mechanism for private benefit at the cost of the people that institution was obligated to protect. Nadia was in the courtroom for the sentencing. She sat in the gallery this time, not at the counsel table. She watched Voss receive the sentence and be let out, and she watched it with the full attention she had given everything in this case, and she felt what she felt, which was not triumph and not relief exactly, but something quieter and more durable than either. The feeling of a debt being paid, not to her, not personally, but to the 22 people in the storage box and the 4 defendants, and Elroy Sattler, and everyone who had driven past the gray brick building on Ridgeline Avenue and felt the particular low-grade dread of an institution that was supposed to protect them and didn't. It wasn't a perfect feeling. It had edges. 14 years for Voss didn't undo 5 years for Darnell Fry. Guilty verdicts for Brunner didn't give Leanne Tatum back the job she'd lost when the conviction went on her record. The mechanism of accountability was real and necessary, and also always running behind the damage it was trying to address. This was something Nadia had known for years and still felt every time, the gap between justice as a legal outcome and justice as a human experience. And the gap did not close, and she had made her peace with doing the work anyway, inside the gap, because the alternative was leaving it to close on its own, which it did not do. Terrence Pickett was sentenced 6 weeks later, 9 years on the fraud and conspiracy counts. His bail business was dissolved by court order. The LLC through which the financial transfers had been routed was dissolved. The $214,000 in recovered funds was ordered into a restitution account for the affected defendants. Cora Malden was cleared in the departmental review. Her internal complaint from November was formally cited in the federal investigation's findings as evidence that the department's complaint suppression system had functioned to silence officers as well as civilians. She was offered reinstatement when the interim oversight structure was established, under the new county sheriff's jurisdiction. She took it. She was 26 years old, and she had made a list of 12 names on a legal pad on the morning after everything changed, and Nadia thought she would be fine. Not perfectly fine, not easily fine, but the kind of fine that comes from having made the harder choice and lived through it. Seth Cord did not face criminal charges. He faced a formal administrative finding of failure to intervene in documented civil rights violations, which went into his permanent record and which he would carry into whatever came next. His voluntary cooperation had been meaningful to the prosecution and had been considered. It had not erased what he had stood by and watched. He resigned from the department in the 4th month. Nadia did not know what he did after that, and she was honest with herself that she didn't need to. The 2 additional officers who were charged pled guilty on lesser counts and received probation with mandatory community service and permanent bars from law enforcement employment. The remaining officers went through individual review and most were cleared, with the understanding that the interim oversight structure and mandatory body camera policy, implemented by the county the week after the indictments, would govern their conduct going forward. The county commissioner's office, under Beverly Sutton, who had stepped into the acting chair role on the morning after the brother-in-law resigned and had stayed, commissioned an independent audit of the HFPD's operational practices and a community consultation process that ran for 6 weeks and involved over 300 Harlow Falls residents. The audit's findings were made public. The consultation's recommendations were formally adopted into a new departmental charter. Nadia was not part of that process. It was not her process to be part of. She had built the case, Price had prosecuted it, the court had ruled on it, and now the community was doing what communities do when the thing that has been suppressing them is removed. They were talking, loudly and imperfectly, and with the specific chaotic energy of people who have been quiet for too long and are now not being quiet. She drove back to Harlow Falls once, 4 months after the Voss sentencing. She hadn't planned to. She was passing through on the way back from a site visit for a different preliminary investigation in a county to the south, and she took the exit on a decision made in about the same 30 seconds as the decision to stop at Donahue's Market had been made, and she found herself on Ridgeline Avenue at 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. The gray brick building was still there. The faded flag had been replaced. There were 2 new vehicles in the parking lot, County Sheriff's Office, not HFPD, because the HFPD as it had existed under Voss was no longer the HFPD, though the department itself was being rebuilt rather than disbanded, with new leadership, the new charter, the body cameras, the civilian oversight board that held its first meeting in the second month. The bars on the lower windows had been removed. This was a detail Nadia had not expected and stood looking at for a moment. The absence of something that had been there for years, just the window now, the glass, no bars. She walked down the block to Paulette's and had coffee. The woman behind the counter, not Paulette, a younger woman, early 20s, looked at her with the faint recognition of someone who has seen a face in a news segment and can't quite place the context. Nadia didn't help her place it. She drank her coffee and paid and stood outside for a moment in the afternoon light. A man stopped beside her on the sidewalk. 50s, work clothes, the look of someone who had just come from or was just going to something physical. He looked at her for a moment. "You're the federal woman," he said. "Yes." He nodded slowly. "My cousin was on that list, the complaints box." "I'm sorry," she said. "About the waiting, about all of it." He looked at the street for a moment. "She got a review?" "Yes." "And it was real?" "They said it was real what happened to her?" "The finding was formal. It went into the federal record." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She cried when she found out, which she doesn't really cry. So," he looked at Nadia, "I just wanted to say something to you if I ever saw you. So." "I'm glad you did," Nadia said. He nodded once more and kept walking. She stood on the sidewalk in front of Paulette's Diner in Harlow Falls, Georgia, on a Tuesday afternoon watching the street move around her, the cars, the people on the sidewalk, a kid on a bicycle cutting across the parking lot of the hardware store, the barber shop with its sign turning in the light. An ordinary town doing ordinary Tuesday things, which was also, from a certain angle, not ordinary at all. Because 6 months ago, this town had been running under a system that treated some of its people as resources to be managed and others as complaints to be buried. And that system had required sustained, deliberate, daily maintenance by people who had decided to maintain it. And it had ended not because it collapsed from its own weight, but because someone had kept showing up in a 10-year-old Subaru with a cracked side mirror and a recorder running, and the patience to build something that wouldn't fall apart under pressure. She had done that. She was not modest about it in private, which was where honesty about your own work belonged. She had done it imperfectly. She had missed page 41 for 7 months. She had focused on the institution until the institution's human contents had to announce themselves through Doyle's email at 6 in the morning. And she had done it nonetheless, and it had held. She thought about what Calloway had said after the sentencing. Good work is just work done correctly over time. That's all it ever is. It just looks different from the outside. It looked different from the outside because the outside only saw the courtroom and the verdict and the headline. The outside didn't see the motel on the south side of town and the recordings that ran in her jacket pocket and the granola bar left over from a different morning and Gloria Chance's daughter eating crow on a Saturday. The outside didn't see the 22 letters or Sandra Fry's okay or the bars removed from a window. She walked back to her car and sat in it for a moment before starting the engine. On the seat beside her was her notebook, the current one, 4 months into a new investigation in a different county, already half filled. She had a meeting in Atlanta tomorrow morning. She had a preliminary document review that needed to be completed before the meeting. She had a person on the other end of the new investigation who did not know she was being investigated yet, and who would, at some point, learn what it meant to have underestimated the person taking notes. She started the engine. There was a thing she had believed for a long time, since before she was a lawyer, since before she understood what she was moving toward, that the people most dangerous to systems of unchecked power are not always the loudest or the most visible or the most publicly credentialed. Sometimes they are the ones who show up quietly, in plain clothes, in a car with a cracked side mirror, asking specific questions in a level voice, waiting for the right moment with the kind of patience that looks like nothing from the outside and is, from the inside, everything. She had learned this not as a philosophy, but as a practice. She had learned it imperfectly, as all real things are learned. She had learned it in motel rooms and courthouse corridors and grocery store aisles where someone's hand had come down on her shoulder and expected to find someone who could be managed. They had found the wrong person. They had found someone who had been told, in 100 different ways across a long career, that she was less than what she was. Too quiet, too careful, too willing to work in the background. Not the face of anything, not the name you'd recognize. They had found someone who had absorbed all of that and used it, who had learned that being underestimated was not a wound but a specific, useful kind of freedom, and who had walked into rooms for years in plain clothes, with a recorder running, building things that lasted. Not everyone has a badge. Not everyone has a briefcase with federal authorization, but everyone has the capacity to pay attention in rooms where something is wrong, to ask for the specific name of the thing being taken, to hold still under pressure and refuse to become what the pressure wants to make you. The world is full of grocery store aisles. The world is full of people being told to stop asking questions. The world is full of 22 letters in a box that no one was supposed to find. Someone always finds the box. She pulled out of the parking space and drove north toward the highway, leaving Harlow Falls in the rearview mirror, the gray brick building with its new flag and its windows without bars getting smaller and then gone. And ahead of her the road and the work and the next town, wherever it was, where someone had been waiting long enough for it to matter that she was coming.